for joining, everybody. I'm live with Heather Cox Richardson, the distinguished Boston College historian, who I very much appreciate joining me on this first Substack Live. Heather, let me ask you, starting with this. You have written about the push and pull over American history of the concepts of hierarchy, some people feeling that they deserve to run the country, versus equality. And that has ebbed and flowed over the years. I want to read you something that I read from Jill Lepore this morning, the Harvard historian in The Atlantic, that I thought was pretty interesting, as soon as I can find it. Okay, Jill wrote this morning, American history is a flashlight. Lately, it's a flashlight whose battery has died. Any analogy to the presidency can be found only in the history of other countries, in the whims and cruelties and fantasies and insanities of the tyrants of antiquity, tin-pot dictators, Latin American caudillos, and modern strongmen. Nero, Stalin, Kim Jong-il. Call the historians who write about those guys, please. And then, mixing a metaphor, she said, if U.S. history is a map, we are off the grid, over a cliff, lost at sea without a compass. What do you think about that?
Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play, right?
Right.
This president and the people around him are unprecedented at the national level in American history. Certainly, we've seen something like this before in the American South from about 1874 to about 1965. But this illiberal strand that runs through American history has been with us all along, and we do have some ideas about how to fight back against it. So, this president is completely unprecedented, but the idea that some people are better than others and have the right to rule is very much a part of American history. And, one of the things that really jumped out to me today, reading the news, is the attempt of the Trump administration to argue that an Afghani interpreter who worked for the United States and has asylum here should be sent back to the Taliban, where he will be killed, simply because they're trying to make this an all-white country. And that really hit me as the idea that regardless of the fact he threw in his lot with the United States, regardless of the fact he did so much for the country, regardless of the fact he and his family have asylum, these people are saying, no, we don't really care if you're going to get killed. That to me was straight out of the 1850s.
The other thing that struck me today was the filing in a federal registry of the administration's intention to lower the cap on refugees admitted to the United States from 125,000, the previous level, to 7,500. And most of those are going to be white South Africans.
Right. Well, there clearly is this attempt in the country right now among those people who are running it to turn this into their fantasy of an all-white country, which it has absolutely never been. And so there are those patterns we can talk about, but there is also, I think, a real pattern of the economy that we're seeing replicated in this moment from the 1850s, the 1890s, the 1920s, and so on, that is really interesting because they are almost deliberately replicating the side that lost ultimately in American history. And I just can't wrap my head around that. I mean, why you look at our past and say, I've got a great idea, I'm going to pretend I'm a Confederate or a Nazi, just floors me.
I also wonder how much of this moment traces back to 2008, the election of Barack Obama, the first African-American president. And I remember talking to Obama during his presidency, and he made the point when he was facing off with Republicans on not just healthcare, but many other things, and especially after 2010, the Tea Party rebellion, and they took over the House. He said they don't want just to roll back the 1960s, the Great Society, the Civil Rights Movement. They want to roll back the New Deal and go back to the 1920s. And as I take in more and more information, was reading a recent biography of J. Edgar Hoover and read about the Palmer raids, which are very evocative of what's going on a much smaller scale right now with deportations. you read Tim Egan's book, Fever in the Heartland, and he talks about the attempt in the 1920s during the period of Jim Crow when the Ku Klux Klan was warning about the rise of Bolsheviks around the United States and fueling its attempt to take over parts of the American political system at that time. Um, Obviously, they're different things in their particulars, but do you think that it's the same basic dynamic or the same motive force?
Liking this video? Then don't just watch, hit like, share and subscribe. And tap the bell so you never miss a video or live show. But if you want early access to exclusive content, then you have to head to zeteo.com and subscribe now. You'll be supporting fearless, independent journalism.
So this is, I think, where the economy comes in. The whole idea of the KKK in the 1920s and the know-nothings in the 1850s and the anti-immigrant sentiments in the 1890s was that the reason that the standards of living were not increasing for people more generally across the country than they were at the very top was because of those people. And one of the things that you see in each of those moments is an attempt of people who are eager for power to leverage the idea of racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, sexism to consolidate power. And while you see it in all the other areas, it really shows up dramatically in those 1920s with the rise of the KKK. And one of the things that's interesting about that second rise of the KKK in the 1920s, very deliberately in Indiana by somebody named D.C. Stevenson becomes the leader of it, is that the roots of that actually are in Reconstruction. And after the takeover of the American South by the Democrats in 1877, a number of African Americans leave the American South, and a pocket of them go to Indiana. And the Democrats in Indiana insist that this is an attempt to rig the vote in Indiana. So Indiana has this pool of the idea that a multicultural democracy is somehow going to be cheating in the elections. So it's a fertile ground for somebody like D.C. Stevenson. And what's so interesting to me about that is, in fact, there is a fever in the heartland. You do get the rise of the KKK all over the country, in especially rural areas where they organize against immigrants in states that don't have a large Black population. My home state of Maine had a strong KKK component in the 1920s. But what's really interesting to that about me is to me is there is a real economic push behind that "we hate those people" thing. And it starts with just "we hate those people." But as the policies of the Republicans in the 1920s increasingly make it impossible for rural Americans and minorities to rise and to prosper, while there's real money going to the very top, that fever does break. And in 1924, for example, the whole idea that D.C. Stevenson was saving America is completely shattered when he rapes and murders Madge Oberholzer. And that really breaks that fever. And what's interesting to me about that, if you look at this moment in American politics, is when you break that racist, sexist, anti-immigrant fervor, what you get is that economic, hey, what's going on here? And I think if you look at American politics today, we're seeing an awful lot of that, hey, what's going on here kind of thing. And that I think is a really interesting element here, that when we focus on the hatred, we tend to miss that people rode that hatred to power. And then when they couldn't deliver the kind of economic promises that they had laid out there, they end up really creating a new kind of economic situation. And, today's news about the fact that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is now saying, the tariffs will be good for us next year. That was, I think, a really big moment where that whole idea that Trump was going to give us lower prices and a better economy and all the things that people hoped for coming out of the pandemic is really blowing up in their faces. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what we create out of it.
One quick observation on D.C. Stevenson that I see parallels in the present, which is that while doing his work in the name of Christian purity and the American way, it was a very morally depraved person who was carrying on that message. And I certainly think we see echoes of that now. But on your point about breaking the fever, yes, it broke in a certain way with the demise of D.C. Stevenson. But in a larger way, especially when you talk about the economic issues, it didn't break really until we had a Great Depression, 1929. Do you think, when you think about how you see the parallels today, do you think it will require uh, not just economic difficulties like we have today, but some sort of a crash to break that fever?
I don't think it will require that. I think, every moment in history is different, and there's a real difference now between now and the 1920s in that we have become accustomed to a system that provides, supplemental nutrition assistance program, for example, and a medical system that incorporates a lot of Americans into it. Not everybody yet, but those losses will be felt even if we don't have a full-blown crash. But that being said, the degree to which we are walking away from antitrust legislation, from the kind of regulations that protect Americans against a crash is pretty dramatic. And if you look right now at the rise of what certainly looks to a number of people like the bubble of AI, lots of us are holding our breath about what the next 2 years is going to look like economically. And of course, this whole business of the cutting of the SNAP payments on November 1st, if in fact the shutdown doesn't end, coinciding with these astronomical increases in the cost of healthcare premiums, combined with the fact the job market has really stopped hiring or is dramatically slowing in hiring, and that we have 3% inflation. We got a lot of things right now that are already causing a real pain that are all coming together at once. And that's going to be, I think, a bit of a shock for people.
And to your point, that's why the Obamacare subsidies have become such a difficult challenge for Republicans. They haven't buckled on it yet, but certainly Donald Trump has indicated he's aware that it's a powerful issue. Let me just say one thing to the people watching. In a few minutes, we're going to take viewer questions. So go ahead and send your questions in via Substack, and we will get to them as we can. Heather, when we were first talking about doing this session, you also wanted to talk about the foreign policy parallels with a century ago. We see the administration menacing Venezuela while doing their deportations, blowing boats out of the water in international waters. Tell me how you see what is similar or different to 100 years ago.
Well, let's start with the period after World War II, when we get the United Nations, we get NATO, we get new kinds of partnerships and alliances. And the reason I want to start there is because the concept of having peacetime alliances, that is, that we will work together during peacetime to make sure that we don't have to work together during wartime, as it were, is a pretty novel concept. And it's one that Americans alive today, with extremely few exceptions, are accustomed to being the norm. And one of the things that the Trump administration appears to be doing is going back to a much older version of world affairs that looks like spheres of influence. And we know this is something that Vladimir Putin of Russia has been encouraging, sort of this great power idea to go back to. And you see that Russia is trying to expand its former imperial power into places like Europe. And at the same time, since he got into office the second time, Trump has really been pushing the idea of United States of America power over Latin America and over Canada and over all the lands in that sphere up to the Arctic, which is incredibly important now.
Using both economic and military threats.
That's correct. And the global warming taking out the ice up there makes that very valuable land for resources as well. And so when I look at what certainly seems to be a an attack not only on Venezuela, but we've also hit Colombians and I believe Ecuadorians. And I look at the fact that we are supporting Javier Milei in Argentina, who is a right-wing ally of President Donald Trump. It looks to me like, in fact, the Trump administration is trying to back off of that post-World War II idea of peacetime networks of support, both economic and military and social, to make sure that we don't have world wars, and instead going to sort of a winner take all, let's be the big dog in this particular arena. And the thing about that is that, we don't have the time to argue about all the different layers of it, but it certainly does invite wars. So this idea that, he keeps saying, I stopped all these wars, and I'm sitting there looking at that going, but you're putting in place a system that quite literally, after World War II, this hugely devastating world war, leaders around the world got together and said, we can't do that again. Let's put together a system that will make sure it doesn't happen. They did that, and now he's dismantling it. And I worry that we're not paying enough attention to that larger picture when we say, oh, look, he smashed another speedboat, which is itself mind-blowing. But that larger picture is not just he's being, out of control and trying to exercise his power against people who don't have a prayer of fighting back, which is one of his hallmarks, but a larger story about world affairs.
Well, do you think that he's doing that? And he's been taking a sledgehammer in multiple ways to our alliances, the alliances that have kept us safe and prosperous. Do you see an actual ideology behind that, or is this just somebody who breaking things?
I think you can have all of those things. I think there are ideologies behind the administration right now. I don't think they're all the same. I think Russell Vought is a Christian nationalist who is trying to destroy the government and take it back to the 1920s. I think Stephen Miller is a white nationalist who is trying to create this fantasy of a white nation. And then I think you have people like the Trump family who are clearly in this for the money and putting in place a kleptocracy. But over all of those things, there is that larger ideology of the idea that some people are better than others and have the right to rule. And that, I think, you can see everywhere you turn with this administration.
I would note that the kleptocracy you mentioned makes Teapot Dome look like lunch money. This is completely on a scale that we've never seen. Let me ask you about another parallel that occurred to me as I started reading another biography yesterday, and that is Huey Long. Huey Long in Louisiana strikes me as having some of the same characteristics in one particular state that Donald Trump has. Do you see similarities between those two figures?
Yes, and Huey Long was a Louisiana politician in the late 1920s and 1930s and managed to get a huge following because he did actually provide some goods for the people of Louisiana. Now, he was profoundly corrupt, and he presented himself as a bit of a clown, so people laughed at him, but he was powerful enough that FDR was very concerned about him challenging him for the presidency and potentially winning. So, yeah, I think that that's very much a good comparison. Now, you don't want to push that one too far because of the way Huey Long ended. It wasn't pretty. But yeah, we have these dictators or dictator wannabes in America. And ironically, it was one of the major things that the framers of the Constitution tried to prevent was the idea of what they called a demagogue. They say the word demagogue in the Constitutional Convention more than any other word because they're very concerned about this. But of course, we know how one prevents that now in the 21st century. You do it through education and rising standards of living, both of which have been slashed dramatically in the United States over the past 40 years. So it's not really a mystery why we're in this moment again.
Heather, we're getting some good questions coming in, so let's take 10 minutes or so to go over those. Let me start with this one. A lot of talk about the degree of resistance that has been mounted to what Trump is trying to do, either from the citizenry itself or from leaders of the political opposition in the Congress and the states. Helen Hills asks a question, which is, why is there no general strike in the United States as there has been in the past in Italy, for example?
So I can't tell you why people are not organizing one now. I know there's an attempt to do it, but I will tell you my take on general strikes in America is that they are not nearly as effective as targeted boycotts. And the reason for that is this is such a big country. So that in a place where we have supply chain issues or in a place where one region has really different interests than another region, often a general strike works against the goal in mind. For example, if you think about there was an attempt at a major railroad strike in the 1890s. It wasn't technically a general strike, but it was a railroad strike, and most goods traveled in the middle of the country by railroad. What that meant was that people literally did not get food, or they did not have access to the kinds of warm clothing or to the heat that they needed going into that fall. And even people who were generally supportive of the rights of workers were furious about that strike. So in other, I can't really speak for other countries, but this is such a large country. A general strike tends to collapse pretty quickly and look weaker rather than strong. Now, on the contrary, look at what happened to Tesla. Look what happened to Target. Look what happened in contrast to Costco, who actually continued to support diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and saw their stocks skyrocket. Look what happened when people turned out to support Jimmy Kimmel. Those targeted boycotts are enormously effective, and they don't end up undercutting your allies. So I think in America, a general strike really is a harder sell than a more targeted boycott. Just because in Maine you're going to lose people if you hurt their heat, and in Arizona you're probably going to hurt people or lose people if you hurt something else. But we're too big.
Um, Joseph Chalant asked a question in light of your notion of things really rolling back eventually to the economic level. And his question is, which specific portion of Trump's base do you see as most likely to break away from him given his economic promises? Certainly, we've seen some young people, some of the Latino and Black support roll back, but what do you see?
So just to be clear, I don't think Trump's true base will ever leave him. I think there is a psychological commitment there for a number of reasons that will never leave. But we also know that the vast majority of Americans actually don't approve of the job he's doing. For the first time in many years, Americans are giving Democrats a big edge on handling the economy over Republicans. And that's a psychological shift that was a very long time coming.
I guess what we mean is that incremental addition to Trump's base that made him president.
So how will those people break off? I mean, you think you can already see real dissatisfaction among agricultural regions and among rural regions that are going to be terribly hit by the problems with healthcare and the problems with the SNAP payments, because those are not just going to affect the people who get those subsidies. They're going to affect anybody who shops at the stores in those rural areas that will now be forced underwater, and the same with the hospitals as well. There is that, but I think there's also the people who are weak. I think Trump supporters are the ones who really weren't involved in politics and who thought he was cool, and they got involved in politics. And you can already see the breaking off of a number of what they call the bro podcasters, who thought he was cool and thought he was going to step in and fix things. And now they're looking, for example, at the extraordinary deportations or the hurt that people are facing in this economy, and
That's
saying,
very striking to see Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, people like that saying, wait, that's too much for me.
yeah, that's right. So I think that's a weakness right there. But I also think there is this as people recognize the real extremes of this administration. I mean, the dude was just in South Korea eating brownies covered with gold. When people back home are not going to have food, there are limits to how much people will put up with.
Well, he's asking the government to write him a $230 million check.
Yeah. Yep.
Of
our tax dollars.
Right. We all remember, or those of us who've read history books remember, that court packing did not end well for FDR. Otto Dix asked the question, do you think that Democrats should advocate for SCOTUS reform now? More judges, term limits, that sort of thing.
That's a great question. I think we do need a bigger Supreme Court. Just aside from anything else, I think we need that. I guess my answer, I have to confess, Mr. Dix, I've never thought about it that way. But I think for me, I look at everything that is immediately in people's faces and think we already have enough on our plate without thinking about worrying yet about changing the Supreme Court when the Democrats have absolutely no power to do it. So I guess I would say no, that should be on the back burner rather than directly in people's faces, just because we all have a limit to how much we can pay attention to. But
Do
it
you
does
see it
need
as
to be on the table.
do you see it as ultimately achievable if, in fact, Democrats, if they were to return to a trifecta in 2029, is that achievable, or is that going to get sent overboard as overreach?
So listen, I don't like to predict the future, but I will tell you, John, I think we've got 40 years or more of rebalancing our democracy ahead of us. And fixing the Supreme Court is just one of those things. I mean, we have a badly skewed electoral college. We have partisan gerrymandering we have to get rid of. We have voter suppression. We have a number of really big ticket items. And the court is one of those. And the issue is that we're going to have to fix all of them. That is largely by taking them back to a fairer system that we used to have. By the way, it was actually in 1929 that we get the House of Representatives capped in order to prevent cities from having more votes in the Electoral College than rural areas. I mean, that was all the way back in the 1920s. So I think there's a lot of things that we're going to have on the table, and that's one of them. And I will say that when America tends to reform, it tends to do it in one fell swoop. So do I think it's achievable? 100%. It's not only achievable, it's necessary. We haven't expanded the Supreme Court since 1860 freaking 9. And we've gotten a few more people since then.
Relatedly, I know your job is principally to look back, but as you look forward and think about it, do you think 10, 15, 20 years from now, Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia will be American states?
I sure hope so. If Puerto Rico wants to be, I mean, that's sort of a given. Everybody says we're going to have that. I think Puerto Rico should have a say in that. But sure, we have a lot of changes that we should make. Certainly, Washington D.C. should be a state, and it may be not just for partisan reasons, but for small d democratic reasons. We should change our representation in our states and in our federal system, because if you think about the caps in the House of Representatives, what it's meant is it's driven districts from what used to be about 30,000 people on average up to almost 750,000 people on average. It's no wonder that people feel like democracy isn't answering to them. They have no idea who their representatives are.
Let me do one more before we go, and that has to do with the debt. Some of us are old enough to have been writing about politics when the Reagan administration came in. David Stockman had a big tax cut, said it was a Trojan horse for trying to leverage down the size of government. Michelle Mulrooney asked the question, do you think the huge debt that exists now, and Republicans, of course, are in power now, will give them traction to defund our safety net, including Social Security?
Well, they're trying to. I mean, that's obviously the point here. The question is,
Can they do it, or do they have the will to do it?
Do they have the will to do it? I think this is why they're turning things over first to Elon Musk and then to Russell Vought. But I will point out that traditionally in American history, until 1981, when you had higher expenses than a debt that people were comfortable with, there was a really simple answer, and that was that you raised taxes. This was just the way it was done. And we are at a point in our history when our taxes on the upper levels of American society are at an all-time low. And we have literally billionaires, people who are worth $500 billion at the same time that children are not going to get support to eat in 2 days. And that is not a recipe for a successful country, certainly not a successful democracy. So, we talk about the debt. I do not understand why everybody is not talking about taxes and about taxing people who have the wherewithal to carry their weight of the society, as they always were asked to do and did so willingly, for the most part, before 1981.
I must say, one of the things that struck me early in the Biden administration was that there were elements of his tax proposals that people who were involved in the tax system, political people who'd worked with both parties in the tax system, who thought it was an absolute layup to take away some of the most egregious loopholes in the system, step up basis of estates, for example. And they just couldn't do it even with full Democratic control of Congress. That has got to tell you something about the strength of the economic system and the economic hierarchy that you have alluded to.
Yes, but it was a different moment then. And, again, one of the things about the Trump administration is everything is on the table. And one of the things that I really think about in our future is all the cards are in the air, and it's up to us to grab them and bring them down and put them into a pattern that creates a nation we want to see. And, we didn't have that even 5 years ago or whatever it was when Biden was in power.
Well, we can hope, and certainly we can see that the things that Trump is doing is energizing parts of the country and fueling what is going to be the next stage of this political narrative in the United States. Heather Cox Richardson, thanks so much for joining us. Fantastic discussion. I think we're going to leave it there.
Thanks, and congratulations on the new show.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to Zeteo.com. Your support matters.